So at this point, let me try and test this out, but let me actually check that everything is in place. I can see that I'm not returning anything, so I need to return this actually. So say return HTML, because remember the method returns a string, so we have to return a string. All right, let's see if we're going to also return false down here as well. So return false, and we also want to return the male variable. So I want to say if male, then we're going to return true. Alright, because this is going to be returning a boolean, even though we've not declared it as a boolean, but we could do. So this method is going to return a bool. So if the male was successful, it's going to return true. If not, then it's going to return false. Right? So let's check that. We're calling the method. Right, so I think it's time for us to actually load up our web page again and see what we're getting back. So if I go back to my main browser, which is the error that we was getting from earlier, so if we just go back to localhost, and let's increase my web page size again to 200. Let's go to register, and let's try and register for a new account and see if we get any errors, because now we're executing that method within our registration action subscriber. If we've got any errors, it's going to throw an error. So let's use our fake filler. Let's say register, and nothing actually happened, I don't think. So let's get our mail trap server back up on our screen. Inboxes, which is my inbox, and you can see that it's empty at the minute. So nothing actually happened. Let's go back and investigate why nothing happened. Right, so it's a bit of debugging, see what is happening. So we're executing on the register method, and flash register event and registration. Right, so when we try and registered, nothing actually happened. So let's try and click register again and fill out register. You can see that we actually got redirected back to the home page. So it tells me that our flash register event is actually working. So if I disable this, let's just disable, let's go back to my editor, let's just disable both of these. Let's debug right here. Let's go back to my editor again. Let's click on register, click on fake filler, register. You can see that we didn't redirect because we've disabled, so we know that our class is actually working. So let me go back to the editor again. Let's uncomment these, save it, back to our browser, going to refresh, new user, register, and you can see we're redirecting again. So it tells me that the redirect event is cancelling out anything else that happens, and I did that on purpose because I know when we're redirecting it's going to kill the script. So we need to execute or redirect at the very last. So even though it's on top, let me bring you back to the screen, even though it's the order that we place these method in is important, but we can also use a second argument within this array to specify in what order that we want the method to be executed. So I can say minus anything with a negative number will be executed last. So if I say minus 1000, I know even though it's on top, this is going to get executed before this one, right? So that's what that was. So if I go back to my browser screen and let's reload, let's try and register, and hopefully now we're going to be hitting that method that we've just created, and we're going to see if it's going to throw any errors. So let's use our fake filler, register, and now we're hitting that method. So now we're getting an error. So let's reduce our screen size so we can see what it's saying. So it says mail facade. So we say magma mail facade basic mail argument 3 to must be of type string. Null is given. Call in registration action subscriber on line 81. So let's go back to line 81 and try and source what that error is. So it's saying that we got an error on line 81, but it's actually line 80 because it's pointing to argument 3, right? So it's saying we get an error. So let's try and var dump this user variable and see what's occurring. Let's put it below here. Let's say var dump user. I'm going to kill this script right there. So if I go back to the browser screen, let's reload. Let's make it a little bit bigger as well. Let's go 170. Let's go 150. We're going to fill that in. We're going to register, and you can see we're getting that object, we're getting that context back because we're var dumping that user variable. But right away I can see that I've got two array. Let me just increase this again. Hopefully you can see. We got an array right there, and we've got another array. So we got an array within an array, and I know by default that we only need an associate array, and the fact that we've got an array within an array is why we're getting that error. So I knew that, and I just wanted to demonstrate. So what I've done, I've created a method that's going to strip that down to just an associate array. So if I go back to my main scene, which is my editor, and I'm going to simply wrap this method in that method that I've created. So it's called flatten context, right? So I'm essentially stripping away the outer array and leaving that inner array. So if I save that, let's go back to the browser and let's reload. Let's try that again. Let's register. You can see now we've only got that one array. So we've stripped away the outer array and leave the inner array, which is what we need, right? So let's go back to my editor. Let's take away that var dump, and we've now got that flattened context wrapped around our event context, and that should now give us our email address, right? So let's see that. Let's try that again and see if it throws any other error. Let's just switch my screen. Let's do reload. Let's click on that and let's click register, and it's saying another error. Says we've got invalid address, right? So it doesn't like that because that is not valid. Well, I don't know why it's not valid. So I'm going to go back to what I was using before. So let's bring it back into my editor, and I'm going to remove that. I'm going to say example. That's no more valid than the YouTube project, but for some reason that seems to want to work, or it should. So let's go back to my browser. Let's reload. Let's click on fake filler, register, and you are now registered. Now that to me looked like something happened because it took a little bit longer to actually process than it was doing before. So if I check my mail trap, you can see now we've got a new account that's just been registered a few seconds ago. So we know that actually worked, right? So if I click it, you're going to see the title that we've just done within our subscriber class. So we'll activate your account. We've got that temporary password that needs a little space right here, so I can put that in. So if I turn back to my main browser, up into my HTML, you can see that it needs a little space right here. So I'm going to put a space in just like so, and you can see the title activate your account. We've got the random password, we've got the message, and we've got the activate now button. So if I turn my screen again, You see, we got activate now, we got the password, we got the body that says please click the link to activate your account. Please also make a note of your temporary password, and that anchor tag that says activate now. So if we look at the HTML source, you can see what that link looks like. Hopefully it will show you what the links look like. So this is the link. So we got the, bringing back to the main screen. So we got where we've defined that link that gets that URL that we mentioned is effectively getting this part of the website for us, of the application for us, right? So if it's a real live application on a live server, it will get the first part of the path to your application. Then the argument that we've put into that actual method, which is this argument right here, this self-activate path, is the path to our activate controller, right? So we got activation, activate. Let's try and increase this a bit as well so you can see it. So we got activation, activate, and that hash, that token that is being generated for us. Now this is the same token that we've got a hash version of in our database, right? So if I load up my database and look for the email address, which is a Mailinator Latour, let's try and find that in our database. Let's go on to, let's try and reduce this down a bit. Let's try and go down to users. You can see that we've got a lot of users that we've been created, because each time we were getting that error, a user was still being registered. Each time we do it, someone was still being registered because that part was successful. The only part was getting an error with is the event, because that's where the error was coming from. But behind the scene, the user was still being registered. So let's try and find that email for that user that we've got in our, which is this one right here, Madison Watts. Let's track it. This is the penultimate one, second from bottom. You can see we've got that token in, which looks very familiar as the one that we've already 75A15A 75A15A, which is the token that we've generated, which is being sent, that we've got in our database, right? Now let's go back to a mail trap. Let's reduce this so we can see what we're doing, and go back to HTML. We're going to click that activate link and see if it's going to load our activate control. So let's just go back to our editor for 1 minute. Let's close this because we're finished with that repository. Let's go back to our controller, which is what we've got right here. But I don't want it doing anything just yet, so I'm going to, let's go to our repository, and we just want to var dump. We're going to var dump right here. We're going to var dump find by. Alright, so let's go back to our browser. We're going to hit that activation link and see where it takes us. So activate, and takes us to an error. So call to a member function find by activation token unknown. So it's still not seeing that method, right? So let's look at, make sure we're spelling that properly. Find by activation token, and let's go to our activation controller. Let's bring up our method. Let's go back to base, domain, actions, activate, action, find by activation token. Right, so let's figure out what's going on here. So we're in our activation controller and it's calling the repository, right? So we've not declared the repository class within our controller, so we need to do that. So we're going to say repository, And this is convention as well to use repository, right? Because that's the property that the single action class is using, as it specifies right here, repository, right? And that's going to equal assigned to our activation repository class. I'm going to say class, and you can see that's imported that for us automatically, activation repository. You're not really seeing what I'm doing because I've not switched my screen stupidly. So what I've just done is I've just added in the next part of the definition, the local definition, which is going to be the activation repository, which is what we created earlier, which is what contains this find by activation token method, right? And the reason why we're getting that error is because we've not loaded that class, so it didn't know what method it was trying to call. And that method is being called by the repository property, which is what we've defined right here as well, which points to the activation repository class. So let's go back to our repository. I'm going to go back to the main browser screen, and we're going to try and reload and see if we're going to get that object. So browser, let's kill that. Let's try and do this again. Activate, and it's showing no. So we know we're no longer getting that error because the method can be found, but it's not returning the object for us. So let's try and figure out why we're not getting the object. So if we'll have a look at our database, let's see what's going on. So we know that's the registered email because that's what it's showing us in our mail trap. So we know it's this account. Let's have a look at the fields and see what we're getting. So that's the value, that's the token value that's been added to the database. But looking at this looks the same as what we've got in this account. So if I go back to the source, it looks the same, which shouldn't be the case. We should have an hash value right here, and this is not an hash value. That's the actual value. So we've done something wrong, obviously. So let's go back to my editor, and let's look at what we've done within our registration action subscriber class. So on this template message method, we're returning the activation token, which should not be right actually. So if I go back to our user validate class, we're returning this token, which is the actual value that's being inputted into our database, but that's not what we need to be doing. This is what I didn't actually see this earlier when I was going through this class, but this is what we actually need to return. Well, we need to retrieve the activation hash, which is the activation hash variable that's coming back from this list function, right? So the token hash is what we pass into the database, and the activation hash is what we're sending to the user's email, which is got the key activation hash. But you can see in our registration action subscriber, we're targeting the actual token, so we need to actually target the hash value, just like so. So I'm gonna have to do that process all over again of registering a user, which should not be a problem. So let's go back to our browser. Let's just close this down. Let's just clear this out. Let's just leave that as it is. Let's just register for a new account. Let's make that a little bit bigger, and we've got a fake filler, and we've got Mallory Perkins, I should say, and it's got that random email. So let's click on register, and let's go back to our mail trap, and you can see we've got that new account that we've registered a few seconds ago. So if we click it, you see we've got that space in between the password, the temporary password string, and the actual password value. So let's look at our source. You can see that looks more like an hash value, so we can try and compare that in our database. So if we go back to users and we want to get second from bottom, which is Mallory Perkins, let's look at the token ash, which is very different from what we've got in our email. So that tells me that we've got the ash version, and that's what we need. So I'm going to go back to HTML source. I'm going to click that link again and see if it's going to eat up our var dump, that variable that was var dumping from our repository. So let's click that link, and there we go. We've got the actual object for Mallory Perkins, whatever that name pronounced. That's the object that we're retrieving via that ash token within the URL, right? So if I go back to my editor and let's go back to repository, you can see this is where we're var dumping that object. So we know that is fine at the moment. So let's get rid of that var dump. Let's go back to our activate action and let's talk about the single action class. So you can see we are storing the object, which is what we've got on our screen. We're storing this particular object in this repository variable. We're checking the variable, make sure we've got that object. Then we're creating a new variable called action. We're saying controller repository, and we're calling the validate activation method, and we're passing in that repository object within that method, and we chained on the activate method onto that. So these are all methods that we've not yet created, and they're located within our activation repository class, right? So we've got the send user activation email, which we will sort out in a minute. But the two method that we just looked at, which is the validate activation, which takes that repository object, and the activate method, which is what's going to change or update our database so we could change the status field, right? So let's actually work on the validate activation method. So what do we need to actually, what are we validating? So we're first going to say if repository equal null, then we're going to say this. I'm going to create an error. This error property is going to be, say, invalid account, right? I'm going to give that a value. It's going to say no user was found. So if the object was null, then we're going to simply output this error. So we need to create this property at the top actually. So we need to say private array errors. I'm going to assign it to an empty array, right? So the next bit that we need to also do is we need to say this user ID, which is a next property that we're going to be creating, because we need the user ID from the repository. So if we're going to update the status field, we need to know which ID or which unique ID that user account belongs to. So we can retrieve the user ID from the repository argument, and we're going to say ID, right? Just like that. And we also need to create a next property called fields, and that's going to equal to an array. We're going to say activation token, and we're going to set that to null, just like so. Then we want to get the status field, so we're going to say comma status, and we're going to set that to active, just like so, right? Then we're going to return this, because this is a method that's going to have another method chained onto it, because by default you're saying that we're seeing that the method is returning self, so we're returning the current object so we can chain the other method onto it. But before I do anything else, let's just fix this up. Semicolon. We need to, what's this saying? Replace invalid correctly. So we need to like define these two properties above. So we're going to say private, and that's going to be an integer of user ID. And we go to private, and let's go to an array, which is fields. I'm going to assign that to an empty array, just like so. Right? So now those two errors have gone. So we've just do a simple quick validation to ensure that the repository is not null. If it's null, we're going to return an error to say that no user was found. And once we go past that step, we know we've got the object within the repository. We can extract the ID from it, and we can also define the fields that we want to change within that particular user object. So the next method, which is going to be active or activate, is where we're going to actually call our database method that we're going to use to manipulate the database. So we're going to say update. That's going to equal this get repo, and a method that we've got in our repository is going to be find by ID and update, right? So the method says find by ID and update. So it's going to find the object by the ID and it's going to update, right? And this takes in a couple of arguments, and the first argument is going to be an array of fields or columns that we want to update, which we've already defined in the method above. So this is the field that we've defined here. We're going to pass it in to say this fields, and note that I did not actually need to create this, right? I could have simple pass in just this array straight into this method as the first argument. I could have done that. The only one that I needed to actually create was a user ID, because this repository variable is only available within this particular method, right? I have not got that available in this activate. I could have if I wanted to, but I've left it, right? So the first argument for this method is going to be the fields that we want to change, and the second argument is going to be the ID of the user object that we want to change or apply these changes to. So we're going to simply say this user ID, which is a tool property that we've created, and you can see that because we've chained on this activate method to this validate activation method, we've got access to these properties which we've assigned values to within this particular method, right? And this find by ID and update method returns a boolean, which is either going to be true or false. So we're going to say if update, and to say return true, else we're going to return false. False, just like that, right? So this send user activation email method, I'm not going to do nothing to it just about yet, because we're already doing that within our event dispatcher. So it might be a method that I take out in the future, but I think this should be all that we need to actually activate the user account. So we're going to go back to our activate action single action class just to ensure that that's all we need to do that. So let's just go through it again, so we got a good understanding. So the first variable that we're creating is a token, and that's going to retrieve the token within that URL, right? So we've got that stored within this token variable. We're hitting up our controller object repository, and then we're going to be calling that find by activation token method and pass that token in. Once we've passed that token in, it's going to return us, it's going to give us back the object that matches that token, right? Once we've got that object, it's being stored within this repository variable, which we're checking that it's not null, and we're passing that variable to our validate action activation method, and we're chaining on that activate method as well, right? And within this method is checking that the repository is not null, and then we are assigning a user ID using that repository ID, right? Now that's being stored within this action variable, which is essentially going to take in, which is essentially a boolean, which is either going to be true or false, right? So you can see down this line, we're doing that check. We're saying if it's a boolean action and action isn't true. So if the action isn't true, we're going to dispatch an error, right? So we're dispatching the error that we've created in this validate activation method. So if I take you back there, you might notice that we've created this errors property, and we've assigned an error if the repository is null. Now we need to return a method, which is what we're calling within our error. So we're calling controller repository get errors. Now we've not got a method that is called get errors, so we have to create that method. So I'm going to say public function get errors, and all we're going to do in here is return this error property, this error, just like so, and we're going to assign it a return type of array, just like so. So we're simply returning this errors property, which we've assigned an error to if that repository was null. And we're simply going to be calling that method within our error object as the error that we're going to return if the action was false, right? So we're saying controller repository get errors, and that's it. So we're checking that the action, which is this, is a boolean. We're checking that if it's not true, then we're going to generate an error for it, else we're going to dispatch this event. And with the context that we're passing back to our activation action subscriber class is just a boolean. So this action variable is either going to be true or false, which really we're not really using in our, let's just show you what we're doing. So in our app, in our event, our activation action subscriber class, you can see we're not really using any context. So this is how we're going to leave it for the time being. If we need to pass context here, we can adjust that within this activate action class and pass other context by chaining on other bits to it. You know, whatever we want to pass, we can do that as well within this single action class. But for the time being, we're only just passing back that boolean value, right? And that is all that this single action class is doing for us in regards to this activation controller. So we're now finished with that. Now I've explained to you all the steps. So finished with that, let's close it. I'm also finished with this particular class. We're going to close that as well. And we kind of finished with the registration action subscriber class because we know that's not working. We're going to close that, and we'll finish with this as well. We'll just close that. Our controller we're finished with, so we're going to close that, and our activation repository is what we're going to now test. So let's go back to my browser. We're no longer var dumping, so I'm going to close this page actually, and I'm going to check this database. So you can see that that's the user that we're about to activate, and you can see the status is set to pending, right? So let's go back to our mail trap. This is the same account. We're going to check that it works. So we're going to say activate, and we're getting an error. So argument 1 event must be of type activation, right? So it's doing something, but we've probably created an error somewhere. So let's go back to our editor. Let's go back into our activation action subscriber, and it's saying activation action subscriber. This is not right. This should be activation action event. So that's where the error is coming from, and that's my error on my part. Let's change that to that. because we are referencing the actual event and not the subscriber. So let's save. Let's try that again. Let's switch my screen. Let's close that page. Let's say activate. Client activate. Again, got another error, and I'm glad that you're seeing these errors because it shows that stuff is working how I want it to work. So what it's saying is that we've gone with the convention, but we have not yet created the activate.html template, right? So let's switch my screen back to my browser, and within my template directory, I'm going to go into the clients directory because we're working on the front end, and I'm going to create a activation directory. So I'm going to say new directory activation in lowercase. Then I'm going to create a activate.html file. So new HTML activate, right? That's it. So I'm going to simply take out what I've got in one of these files and just copy it over. Just clear that out. I'm going to paste that, and I'm going to just clear this up, get rid of that, and get rid of all these links, and I'm going to simply just pass in some content in here. So I'm going to say welcome, your account is now activated, please log in. I'm going to simply provide a login link back to our login form or login page. So I'm going to say /login, login now. Yeah, something as generic and simple as that. So now that we've got that form, let's just give that a title as well. Say activation. So that's fine. We don't need to pass that in anywhere because once as I've said, our controller and the logic that we're using will know the location of that template so long as we've defined it, which we didn't do, which is why we're getting that error. So let's just load up my front end again, and I'm going to close that. Now that we've got our template ready, I'm going to try it again, activate, and now it's showing that message, welcome, your account is now activated, please log in, right? So before we log in, let's go and look at the database and see if it's done the changes that we specified. So I'm going to reload, and you can see that on this account that we're activating, you can see that the status is changed to active, and you can see that our activation token is now set to null because that's the field that we've defined. So if I take you back to main editor and into our repository, you can see that we've set our activation token to null and we've set the status to active, so we know that is now working, right? Now let's try and see if we could log in, which is now the important test. Let's go back to our browser. We know that the password has been automatically generated for us, which we've now got hold of in our email. Let's copy that. Before we copy that, actually, let's try and get the email address because we have to log in via email. Let's just copy this. Let's copy that. And our activation, let's click on the login now to take us back to our login page. Let's paste our email address there. Let's get the email that we've got, copy, and try and log in, paste, log in, and there you go. We've just logged in successfully with this user that we've just created. You can see the email is right there, email object, first name, last name, full name, gravatar, status is active. So I would say that was a success. So we've managed to create an activation system which now allows us to register and confirm our email address and then activate our account to make it so we can log in. And I can demonstrate as well. So if I go back to the database, I'm going to just change this around. Let me just log out first. Actually, let's log out first. Log out. Log out. Our session is dead. Let's go to our database. Let's change this back to pending. Pending. And let's try and log in again with that same information that we've just got. So back into our database, let's get that email address again. It's going to be this one. Copy that, paste it. Let's get the password. Copy, paste. Let's log in. You can see nothing is happening. Nothing is happening. We're not being able to log in because, or even though it's not showing a message, which is something we'll work on in a future video, it's not logged us in because our status in the database pending, our status is set to pending, and you cannot log in until you've activated your account, right? So let's go back into our database and change that back to active, right? And let's grab that email address again. Paste that back in. Let's grab that email, that password. Copy. Paste. Click on login. And now you go. And there you go. We're now able to log in. And you can see it's showing my name because that is hard coded in. Let's actually make that dynamic so it actually shows the login user's name. So if I take you back to my editor, let's just close these down because now we're finished with them. And let's go to my home controller because that is the route that's currently wire dumping this object. You can see I've just got my name hard coded in. So I can make that dynamic by doing curly braces. I'm going to say privileges or privilege user. And I'm going to use the object operator. I'm going to get the first, actually let's get the name because you can see that within the object we've actually got a name, a full name, which returns the full name. So let's just get that full name string. So full, let's go back to my editor. So I'm going to say full name. Save that. We're going to go back to our browser. We're going to reload, and there you go. It's displaying dynamically now, displaying the logged in user name, your name for the logged in user, right? So that was a success. That's our activation system. I will be updating our GitHub account to reflect all that we've done now. So if you just coming along, you would have access to all these code that we're writing. I mean, I tend to, when I'm off screen, just go through it again, not change nothing, but just make sure everything is in place and it looks good. And in the next video, if there is something that I missed out, I can then touch back onto it before we carry on. So again, everyone is in the loop. Well, now that was a simple, well, simple-ish activation system that we've created that's now going to go hand in hand with our registration system. In the next video we're going to be doing is we're going to be implementing a password recovery system. So if you lose your password or you forgot what it was, we can then generate a new one. And we're still going to be using the emailing system because we have to email you that new password or the new reset link, which allows you to come back to the website and enter a new password so you could log in again. So that's going to be the next video coming up. Within this series is going to be the password recovery system. So stay tuned for that one. I hope you got value from what I'm doing here. I mean, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel because we now think we at 430 something. We're trying to get that push to 500. So please like, share, subscribe to the channel. If you're getting any value, leave comments down, ask whatever questions you want because I tend to answer all questions that's been posted to me. So I mean, try and build a community right here. I will be doing eventually sometime down the line, probably do a Patreon system where I'm going to be having like exclusive content on there which is a follow-on from each of these videos. So for more extended highlights of what we're doing, the Patreon is going to be there for that, but I haven't ventured into that yet. We're trying to build a community right here first and get that up to some very, very good numbers. So you guys are going to be helping me out doing that. Again, please like, share, subscribe to the channel, like the video, dislike the video if you want that, and I take all of that on board, and I'll try and do better in the next one and try and explain a lot more. So that's how we're going to go about doing these videos. We're going to be trying put as much context as possible on what I'm doing, so you know exactly where stuff is coming from. And I will be also be jumping into some of the components as we go along to either go over them with you or quickly summarize what they're doing, because I really want everyone to understand how everything works, right? So stay tuned, because we're going to be doing the next video within this series that's coming up pretty shortly. Thank you and peace out.